Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Stott, I'm the Emperor of Stomaria, and today I want to talk about the rebranding and the revitalization of the Imperial Guard. Now, the Imperial Guard as a policing or a security, government body or institution, or however you may wish to define it, has been around for some years. In fact, it was in 2019, not long after we were founded, that we actually acquired the sabres that are expected to be carried by members of the Imperial Guard for private functions. And when I say private functions, I am talking about events that are for Stomarians and Stomarian citizens on private freehold land, because these aren't obviously weapons that we will be brandishing or carrying about in the public space, because obviously there's certain legalities there which would prevent us from doing so. But even though they are lethal weapons, they are just for show. But the reason and the rationale for us having these is that they add a sense of realism to everything, because they are genuine, they are real, they are lethal. And the people that are carrying them, will be expected to be responsible with them. So there is a lot of trust that has to go into providing certain individuals with these sorts of weapons. There's no other way to describe them, really. They are swords, they are sabres. And so as I say, the institution itself, the body itself, has been around for some time. But it wasn't until early 2020 when the formal ceremonial uniforms were actually completed. Now, even though it is a sort of a policing, a security institution, body, their primary purpose, in a nutshell, would be to act as stewards for public events, to be a representative of Stomaria, of its values, of its objectives, to be the creme de la creme, the best of the best, if you like, in terms of Stomarian citizens that have gone above and beyond the call of duty and have expressed an interest in forming a part of that particular branch. This is the purpose of the Imperial Guard, to be a physical embodiment of Stomaria, to represent Stomaria, and to put on a show, if you like, during these sort of engagements, these public engagements on private land. And the issue, obviously, is that in early 2020, once we had established the uniforms, once we established the attire and the equipment and everything that would go with the Imperial Guard, the pandemic hit. And so obviously that was all put on the back burner for some time, because it was not something that was very important to develop if we weren't able to meet in person in any large groups. It seems very surreal now to think back on those days, having, over the last however many months or year or so, been able to, go about relatively freely and unhindered for the most part. So that all aside, the Imperial Guard was very much put on the back burner. And it wasn't until relatively recently where I was talking to Ben Harvey, who is actually Lord Harvey of Stomaria. He's the first Stomarian noble that we ever had, and is in fact the first Stomarian citizen we ever had outside of members of the Imperial family. And this goes way back to 2020, when we started first recruiting citizens outside of the Imperial family. And he has kindly agreed to help me establish the Imperial Guard as a more real and genuine and proactive body. And one of the first things that I wanted to iron out was the uniforms, the attire of the Imperial Guard. Because for those that don't know, we actually have two uniforms, or we had two uniforms. One was the ceremonial uniform, and one was the more, the practical field uniform, if you like, the kind of uniform we were going to be using for things like target practice or pest control, or the hunting of small game, or even for hosting particular events, depending on the nature of the area in which we're hosting it. So if it was like a muddy woodland or anything, you might not necessarily want to bring your fine ceremonial uniform to that kind of location. And the issue with this, with having the dress uniform, the dress ceremonial uniform, and the field uniform, is that it created a lot in the way of expenses. Because a ceremonial uniform is custom made. So it is something that is made entirely from scratch. It's not some jacket that we pulled off a shelf and amended. It is, from fabric created by a tailor to specific measurements, to specific requirements. And the issue with that, obviously, is it is extremely expensive. I think it costs somewhere between £350 and £400 for that particular uniform, for the ceremonial uniform that we designed, which was the sort of prototype, if you like. Even though what we wanted to do was going to be slightly more dressed down, slightly simpler, it was still going to cost a significant amount to produce. But then we also had to get the field uniform, which was also not hugely expensive, but it added on to the cost. So to fully kit out a single member of the Imperial Guard would cost somewhere in the region of £750 to £800. And that included like the sabre and the belt and the boots and all the rest of it, things that weren't included in the actual uniform itself. But it was an extraordinary cost, and not something that we wanted to burden ourselves with. And so one of the first things we wanted to do is try to rebrand the Imperial Guard where we could, in order to mitigate those costs. And so what we've done is we've created a uniform which is basically supposed to fulfill both roles. So it's supposed to act as a dress uniform, but also a field uniform. So some minor adjustments to it, taking off the fancy dress belt and whatever, all the rest of it, it will become more practical. So you can go out there and you can, dig trenches or chop wood, or, actually be engaged in real world activities in that uniform. And then if it gets dirty or anything like that, you could just bang it in the wash and then clean it that way. Whereas with a ceremonial uniform, you can't obviously do that. And doing it this way, with this blend of dress uniform and field uniform all in one, it's saved us a considerable amount going forward. It still costs somewhere in the region of £400 to fully kit out a member of the Imperial Guard. But again, that includes things like the sabre and the boots and all the rest of it. But it has effectively halved the cost of kitting out a member of the Imperial Guard. So that was one of the first things I wanted to do. Now, in terms of the design and the style of the uniform, I looked to history, as I do for all things regarding Stomaria. And even though my interest in history, my personal interest in history, goes as far back as the ancient Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Carthaginians, the ancient Greeks, and all the rest of it, that's the sort of time period, ancient history, that I'm interested in. But I'm also interested in the early 20th century. And in particular, something that I've been looking into, particularly the last couple of years, was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, this is an empire like many others, in the sense that it consisted of various peoples, various cultures, and it was held together through force of arms for the most part, if not coercion and intimidation and all the rest of it. So it's obviously, I'm not trying to justify it in that way, because Micronations are obviously different from Macronations in a lot of ways, but one of the most significant ways, I think, is that Micronations are built on voluntary association. People join Micronations voluntarily. They leave Micronations voluntarily. There's no mechanism in which you can force someone to stay or force someone to join in the first place. But it was nevertheless an interesting empire to research and delve into. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from nations or empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what to do and what not to do. And interestingly enough, the actual sabre that we use for the Imperial Guard is actually Hungarian in origin. And we chose this one in particular because it is a blend of cultures representative in this sabre, in the sense that if you look at the handle of the sabre, it's very much Western in design. It's like a Western medieval knight. And the blade itself, with the curvature, is something that you would find in the Middle East. And that's no coincidence, that's no accident. It's because of Hungary's geographical location between East and West. And that blend of civilizations, that blend of cultures, is something that we wanted to take on board, because that is effectively what Stomaria is. We do look to history through all periods of history, and we see what works, and we see what doesn't work, and we apply what does work, and we try to mitigate what doesn't. And so, with all that said, the uniform that we have gone with is based on one of the uniforms that was used by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it wasn't simply because it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire that this was chosen. It was just one of the more aesthetically pleasing uniforms that I could find, that I quite liked. But it was largely a coincidence, actually, that the colour grey was chosen, because we did have a range of options in terms of colours that we could choose, but each of them presented a particular problem. For instance, we had dark navy, which was probably one of the first choices, one of the first considerations, because, you know, even though it was navy, it was blue. But the problem is, it was such a dark colour that, first of all, I was worried it was going to clash with the brighter colourings that we typically use, the whites, the golds, and the slightly lighter blues, in the flag, for instance. But it was also dark in the sense that you could perhaps from a distance mistake it for black, and there is nothing that I think that would harm us more than having a bunch of men and women dressed in what looked like black shirted military uniforms wandering about. So I didn't want to give that impression from the outset. So wanting to avoid any sort of fascistic looking tendencies, and not wanting to have any of our lighter colours clash with a dark uniform, that was put to one side. Khaki was considered because it is a uniform that has been used for many, many years in various countries, and especially in the early 20th century by many nations and empires. But the issue with that is that even though that it was a relatively neutral colour, it wasn't going to clash with the colourings or anything like that, there were two issues with khaki. The one being, again, you don't really want people wandering around in brown shirts, if you catch my meaning, in military attire in brown. You don't want that stigma necessarily from the outset. So that's not something we were keen to do. But more importantly, and to the point, khaki is also something that's relatively heavily used in the British military. And even though sometimes it's like a khaki camouflage or anything like that, I just didn't want any association with the British military for, as I say, moral and legal reasons, because I think it's not the done thing. Certainly in this country, I don't know how it is elsewhere in the world, but you do not go around in Britain trying to imitate or replicate uniforms from the British Armed Forces because people can get the intention that you're actually a part of the military establishment. You're a member of the military personnel, and it, I think, leaves a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, mine included, when people do try to give a false impression. We're obviously not trying to do that, but I don't want anyone to grab the wrong end of the stick. I don't want anyone to approach us and go, "Thank you for your service," or something like that. You know, that would make me feel awful. And so we try to make the uniform as distinct as we could from the British military, because we are obviously based in Britain, and the Imperial Guard is going to be used primarily, if not exclusively, within the British Isles. And so, having considered those options, we also looked at olive, but it didn't really go with any of the uniforms that we had, again, because it's green, it might clash. Any camouflage colorings, or regardless of the color, anything camouflage related could be mistaken for a genuine active member of the British Armed Forces, military personnel. And so again, we just wanted to avoid that. And grey was really the last colour that we could use, because it's not a colour that's heavily used by the British military, certainly in the way that we use it. And so we settled with that. Now, the reason we use black as a black cap, black belt, and black boots is because even though originally we were going to use a white belt, for some reason, this particular uniform, the grey, it does not come with a grey cap. Every other uniform that we looked at in terms of their colours, they all came with the equivalent in cap and trousers and all the rest of it. But for some reason, the grey uniform did not have a cap. And this bugged me to no end, because I've got serious OCD when it comes to this sort of thing. But I decided to turn this into an opportunity. So originally I thought, well, maybe we can just do without the cap. But I think going forward, people will want a cap. If it's raining or if it's too sunny, people will want a cap. People will want headwear. And so we had to have one. And the only one we could really choose that wasn't going to clash too heavily or too much with the rest of the attire was black. And if we had a black cap with black boots, that would kind of work. But we had the white belt, and the white belt would just look out of place. So we had to change the white belt for a black belt. And then that black belt would also match the black scabbard of the saber. And the handle of the saber is gold, so we could utilize, we could match that up with the patches, which have a sort of gold rim, and then the white button badges on either collar would match obviously the white on the actual patch on the arms as well. So it all kind of ties in together in some form or another, and we've really done the best we can on that front. But the reasoning, the rationale as to why we chose the colours we have done, and the reason that we have the setup that we have done, is because we've decided to take a military uniform, which is made to military specifications. It is incredibly hardy stuff. It is an actual US uniform. It's a military uniform made for United States military, or was. It's actually decommissioned now, which is why we use it. But it is made to military grade specifications. So it's incredibly hardy, it's incredibly durable, but also with the attire that we have attached to it, it gives it that early 20th century look, or more of a look than it would otherwise. And I think it just looks quite aesthetically pleasing in that way, but it also is practical. It's a pragmatic, useful uniform that we can use for real world activities. And that's the point. We have created a hardy field uniform that it also doubles up as a dress uniform. And I think that is largely all I wanted to discuss on the uniform front. I think I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover with regards to the uniform itself. Now, in terms of the Imperial Guard itself as an institutional body, we are going to be looking to ramp up the recruitment of Sumerian citizens into the Imperial Guard if these individuals that apply are suitable. This isn't an open door policy. Not every Sumerian citizen will be invited or permitted to join the Imperial Guard. As I say, it is something that entails a great deal of expense and a great deal of commitment, because you have to be present to be worthwhile. There's no point in having members of the Imperial Guard in South Africa if they're never going to visit the British Isles and perform the functions of a member of the Imperial Guard, because the functions, as I say, is primarily as stewards, as a physical embodiment of what Stomaria is, and representative of our values and our objectives. So we need the best of the best in terms of a full understanding of what Stomaria is and what we're striving to do, but also they need to be, relatively speaking, local to the British Isles. Somewhere in the British Isles would be ideal in order to be able to fulfill their duties. Now, with that in mind, as I say, we are sort of opening the door more gradually to other people joining the Imperial Guard, and I look forward to recruiting more citizens and more supporters into the Imperial Guard going forward. So if you did want to apply for that position, if you did want to form a part of the Imperial Guard, then please do get in touch and let us know. As I say, for the longest time, it was myself that was sort of spearheading this. I was just trying to put all the pieces in place. I now also have Lord Harvey, who is helping to establish the Imperial Guard in a more significant way. He has some experience in sort of reenactment circles, for instance, so he's familiar with some of the attire and some of the health and safety regulations and laws and all the rest of it regarding all of the issues surrounding this particular topic. But that all aside, we do want to expand that further. I would like, a handful of people, Stomarian citizens, to become members of the Imperial Guard within the next year or so, because I think having that physical presence, being able to be all dressed up in a single familiar uniform and performing certain functions or holding certain events with people dressed up in this attire, I think will be a powerful statement. It will give the right impression. And that's why we have to make sure that the right people sign up to become members of the Imperial Guard, because they are going to be representing Stomaria on the world stage, if you like, and that's going to be something that's very important. So with all that in mind, if you did want to become a part of the Stomarian community and even a member of the Imperial Guard, then please do so through our Patreon campaign, the link of which I shall leave in the description below as always. You can also find the details of the other micronations that make up the Empire of Stomaria in the description below as well. But otherwise, if you did enjoy this video, then please feel free to give it a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.